Social Summit is taking place in Boksburg on the East Rand, preceding the weekend's G20 Leaders Summit, which of course will see leaders of the world's leading economies convene for the first time on African soil. The G20 Social Summit aimed at including various sectors from youth, formal and informal networks, faith-based groups, community forums and grassroots structures. President Cyril Ramaphosa will today deliver the closing address. Samkele Maseko is there to talk us through what's been happening there and, of course, the expectant arrival and closing address by the President. Samkele, good morning to you.
Indeed, and the President will close the G20 Social Summit today, which has seen a number of non-governmental organizations, civic organizations across the African continent and even in the diaspora, looking at how they can be included, particularly in the conversations when the G20 leaders meet this weekend. It comes at the backdrop of a various number of negative reports on this G20 that is being hosted by South Africa, particularly by the United States of America. You've seen a number of government representatives of the United States of America saying that this is a G100, that there are bad things happening in South Africa, there is the ostracization of a particular racial demographic within the country. That was said by President Donald Trump of the United States of America, who said was not coming. This particular gathering was seen and put together by Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, the former Deputy President of South Africa, and Khumbudzo Ntshavheni earlier on in the week when there was opening this particular conference. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka questioned and called upon African leaders to lead Africa to prosperity, noting that Africa has over 50% of the world's arable land and that Africa is and should not be a poor continent. But if it is poor, it is attributed to poor leadership within the African continent. I am going to speak to a political analyst, Mpho, to extensively speak about the past 2 days and 3 days that have culminated to this closure today of this G20 Social Summit, and how some of the recommendations and the resolutions taken here will ultimately be discussed by the G20 leaders over the weekend.
Listen, it has been a good week so far. And today, because this is the closing, we're looking forward to so many things, including the social declaration, which all these engagement groups are going to hand over to the President so that he gives it to the G20. And that declaration is essentially a document that is going to show the interests and the cries of essentially civil society organizations, traditional forums, traditional groups, and essentially non-governmental actors, so that they can have their voice represented in the larger rooms where policies are created and where the decision making takes place.
If you look at South Africa's G20, it is anchored around inclusive growth. That inclusive growth will include non-governmental organizations. We've seen some leaders of the world, particularly the United States President Donald Trump, saying this is the G100, and ultimately saying that it is not about the leaders anymore, and it is inclusive of so many variety of groupings that takes away the essence of the G20 summit. Yet South Africa's theme of this G20 is inclusive growth, particularly when you look at the inequalities that are there in the economic disparities globally, and in particular Africa getting what we may say the end of the stick of the global economy.
Listen, Africa is in fact getting the short end of the stick. I think it was discussed a few days ago here at the summit. In fact, yesterday at one of the sessions, and one of the things that was brought up was that Africa is the youngest continent and has the youngest people based on a continent globally. And so it is important to factor in the voices of the majority and also look at the people who we claim to speak on behalf of. So one of the themes is in fact inclusivity. And what this means is, while we are trying to make the world a better place and while we're dealing with macro and micro economic policies, we also have to focus on social development, because these policies are not going to do anything for us if they do not represent the needs of the people they're supposed to serve. So it is a good thing that we are being inclusive in this session. And I mean, Trump is Trump. You know, we take him as he is, but we do know that for the greater good, it is important that the members of the Global South, who also constitute majority of the world's population, have their needs represented on broader stages and also have their specific interests advocated for in those specific rooms, so that even when we claim to advocate for them, they can actually see the fruits of their opinions and their policy prescriptions being acted out globally.
When you look at the declaration of this social summit, particularly noting that the declaration of the G20 summit has also come under heavy scrutiny, one nation is saying that there should be no declaration coming out of this G20 being hosted in South Africa due to their absence. Will this declaration of the social summit hold water over the weekend?
It should. I think people are forgetting that unlike the United Nations Security Council, there is no country with a veto power here at the G20. These are all equal actors, including the African Union and the European Union. And so long as the majority reaches a consensus on what is going to fully represent the needs of their people, then we should be okay and it should be adopted. The US is trying to show a force of power to say we are in charge, and we are very uncomfortable with other actors, especially people on the African continent, showing the world that they don't need us present in order to continue. So the social declaration, I'm hoping it will be adopted, especially because these are recommendations and not things that are binding. But we are hoping that all the countries that have gotten together and that have reached a consensus will, even without the opinions or the input of one state, continue to do what is best for their people and the global south in general.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mpho. This is going to be rather interesting, particularly when you get the social declaration at the end of today, and particularly the inputs that President Ramaphosa and his other fellow G20 leaders are going to deliberate over the course of the weekend. You do know that the declaration has come under heavy scrutiny. We've seen a number of business delegations, in their majority from the United States of America. They've converged within the tip of Africa on South African soil to engage on various economic issues, particularly when South Africa speaks about inclusive growth and the change of the global economic architecture that is largely skewed against the African continent and particularly the youngest population in the world. We speak about a just transition when it comes to energy generation and carbon emissions, and it must be just, and it must not be against the growth of the African continent and the reindustrialization of the African continent in order to bring about economic growth of these underdeveloped nations, particularly coming from the African continent, Leanne, which is going to be a very huge topical issue on the change of the global economic architecture and inclusive growth, which is what President Ramaphosa has been speaking about, particularly in the past 3-4 years. If you look at the advent of COVID-19 during that particular era, when you were speaking in France on how Africa at times felt like they had to be beggars to the global economic superpowers and how they hogged the vaccines to themselves and just left the African continent to their own and their own devices without proper assistance and making Africa feel like beggars.
All right, Samkele Maseko at the social summit that's taken place, ending today. The president expected to give that closing remark at the end of some of the, hopefully, important points that are going to be put into that communique that'll be handed over to the Leaders Summit.